afternoon, everyone. I'm Domenica Essie, the Education Manager here at the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. Thank you for tuning in to today's Hot Talk on immigration enforcement rights and resources. Wanted to plug just one thing before we move on to the program. We do have another Hot Talk on March 5th on policy shifts within the Trump administration. So another installment on this topic coming up next month at noon via Zoom again. So I'll turn it over to our speakers. We have Lindsay Self with the Haber Legal Group. She's also on our board of directors. We have Adrian Coppola, who is the Associate Director at Catholic Charities, and Morgan Morissette with Legal Aid of Southeast and Central Ohio. They put together this program in response to obviously everything that's going on. So thank you to each of you for putting this together so quickly and looking forward to this program. I'll turn it over to Lindsay, who will be moderating today.
Thank you, Domenica. Real briefly, so you get to know who our panelists are today. Adrian and then Morgan, can you just share a little bit about your practice areas and the general communities that you serve?
Yeah, so thank you for having us. Thank you, Lindsay. My name is Adrian Coppola. I'm the Associate Director of Catholic Charities Immigration Legal Services. We are based in Cleveland, Ohio, and we are part of Migration and Refugee Services here in Cleveland. We serve immigrants in Northeast Ohio in the Diocese of Cleveland and the Diocese of Youngstown. We provide full legal representation. Again, our practice is limited to immigration only. We have a staff of 10 attorneys and 3 Department of Justice accredited reps. We typically assist about 1,800 immigrants a year with direct legal representation. We also provide Know Your Rights presentations, a lot of community outreach and education, and pro se clinics for individuals who can't find full representation. I'll turn it over to you, Morgan.
Thanks, Adrian. My name is Morgan. I am a pro bono coordinating attorney at LASCO, formerly Columbus Legal Aid, but I used to work at Catholic Charities in Cleveland, and it hasn't been too long since my shift, so I keep saying Cleveland. I am split between our pro bono team and our immigration team, and I mostly do recruiting and training volunteer attorneys who are not necessarily immigration attorneys. I mentor them through the process of doing an immigration case and hopefully get them to take on more immigration cases. I do a lot of community-facing trainings for teachers, for social workers, for attorneys, and Know Your Rights presentations as well. That's pretty much it. It's my 13th year of doing immigration practice and my 3rd administration, so it's always changing.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Adrian, I'm going to pose this question to you, and this question could be an hour all on its own. So can you briefly describe to us the executive orders that have really put immigration in the spotlight recently? Can you tell us what those orders are, what they do, and what communities they impact?
Yes, this definitely could be an hour. In fact, I'm doing an hour presentation on it next month. So I'm going to try to go through and respond to your questions in the next 5 to 10 minutes. But so in the last few weeks, the new administration, they issued a series of executive orders and policy directives that really aim to reshape immigration law in this country. The first one I'll bring up is the nationwide implementation or re-implementation of the Remain in Mexico policy. So this was done the first time during the first administration, and what it really did was require asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their U.S. immigration cases are processed. And it affected individuals seeking asylum status in the United States, and the lack of access to counsel, the creation of those tent cities, and all the violence and the dangers that arose out of those tent cities. So that was reestablished. There was a termination of parole status for individuals from certain countries like Cuba, Venezuela, parole program, Haiti and Nicaragua. This was used as a lifeline for many of those individuals fleeing political instability and violence in those countries. It allowed them to come to the United States legally with a sponsor. Without this program, a lot of individuals, they're turning to dangerous migration routes. The individuals that were here, with the termination of their parole status, it's going to put them at risk of deportation because of that, if they don't seek a more stable status in the United States, if they have access to it. There was something known as CBP One app appointments. A lot of asylum seekers, they were allowed to come to the border and schedule an appointment through the CBP One app. They terminated the use of that app, and that was really important. It really facilitated the flow of immigrants coming to the border. I think everybody has heard that they've started deploying the military to the US-Mexico border. What this really means is instead of using trained asylum officers to process cases, we now have military soldiers at the border. This escalates the situation and it creates fear among a lot of migrants coming to the border. There are a lot of stricter asylum policies that came out of these executive orders. They increased asylum restrictions. Seeking asylum in the United States is a legal right under US and international law, but the new restrictions are making it nearly impossible for people to apply. And they made it harder to qualify for asylum in the past, and they plan on making it harder to apply for asylum now. That would leave a lot of individuals without protection and at risk of deportation back to their dangerous home countries. Another thing that has been in the news lately is the increased deportation efforts that come out of these new immigration policy directives. Deportations are, they're ramping up across the country. You're going to see them more heavily focused in the larger metropolitan areas, but we do have them happening in the Cleveland area as well. They're not just targeting people with serious criminal convictions, which is what you're seeing mostly in the news. Now, a lot of collateral arrests are happening. So individuals with pending asylum applications, or even those with parole status, and even US citizens are getting picked up in those collateral arrests and detained while they figure out their nationality. The expansion of immigration detention facilities, that's another big one. So instead of investing in alternatives to detention like ICE check-ins or ankle bracelets, the administration is building more detention centers and expanding the number of people that can be held in immigration jails. They're entering into contracts with facilities to really up the amount of ICE detainee beds available. So this just means inherently that more people are going to be arrested, more people are going to be detained while they seek the asylum process, which, as you know, common sense wise creates a lot of barriers for that individual when they're detained and fighting a case. There's been talks of withholding federal funding from sanctuary cities or organization or enforcement agencies that do not comply with ICE. So really putting pressure on them to, if you make a traffic stop and the individual is undocumented, you're supposed to detain them and refer them over to ICE for processing. They are reviewing a lot of humanitarian programs as well as a result of these executive orders, one of them being temporary protected status and another being parole. We've seen recently that the Trump administration has revoked the TPS status for Venezuelans. This was initiated by, or redesignated or extended by Biden just a couple months ago. And then within the first month in office, Trump revoked that, affecting 300,000 Venezuelans in the country. He's looking at the parole status of not only the Cubans, Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, and Haitians that entered our country, but also the Ukrainians and Afghans that entered our countries in the last couple of years. And last but not least, the suspension of the refugee admission program. So he put a 90-day suspension on all refugee admissions. Our office here at Catholic Charities, we resettle about 400 to 500 refugees a year, and that whole program was shut down. Although he's supposed to review it every 90 days, we are hearing from our national partners that this is likely to last for 3 to 4 years. And I think I can also touch on the federal funding freeze that has, I know it's impacted it has a widespread impact in the country, but how it impacted us, it decreased or stopped the funding flow for refugee resettlement. And it also stopped some of our other programs. Specifically, our program has a grant to the Department of Homeland Security to provide citizenship services to green card holders and educating them on civics and English. That funding stream was stopped as well. So that's kind of an overview. I hope it's helpful, but Morgan, do you have anything to add?
Not to the executive orders. No, that was very comprehensive.
Adrian, you touched a little bit on some of these that we saw similar orders back in 2020 or so. Is there any in particular we should know that are new or different, or ones that are similar to the ones back in 2020?
Yeah, so but there's some similarities and there's some differences just because immigration law, I mean, the immigration climate has changed since the first administration. So I'll start with similarities. There's always been an emphasis on border security. In both years, the administration really prioritized strengthening border security in 2020 and before. This included directives to enhance physical barriers, so building the wall, increasing personnel at the U.S.-Mexico border, and this time around, he declared a national emergency at the southern border, leading to the deployment of military personnel. So that's one area where it's similar. Another is restrictive measures on asylum seekers that happened last time. The creation of the Remain in Mexico policy, the expansion of the policy, the change of case law to really restrict the type of people who would qualify for asylum that happened last time. We expect to see it this time. And then targeting sanctuary cities that, individual cities that, welcome immigrants into the community and are self-designated as a sanctuary city, and imposing penalties on them for doing that. One difference is the termination of the humanitarian programs. We didn't have as much TPS, temporary protected status, and parole as we do now. The expansion of parole really came out of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan and the relocation of 75,000 Afghans to our country, and then the war in Ukraine and allowing all those individuals access to the parole program. The Trump administration has already said they think it was an abuse of this program, and they revoked the Cuban, Nicaraguan, Haitian, and Venezuelan. So really just taking that's new because it didn't really exist the first time. Another new one, I have to touch on it because it's been in the news a lot, is the use of Guantanamo Bay to detain immigrants during their removal proceedings. Yes, they expanded detention the first time, but this is, to a whole new level, detaining individuals in a separate country, especially one as notorious as Guantanamo Bay. So that's new. Let's see if there's any more differences. I think, Morgan, you'll maybe touch on this, the legal impact of all these executive orders and what happened the first time and what we've already seen happen as they try to enforce these executive orders.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on that. So if you're not practicing in this area of law, if you're not super involved in this community, all you really have access to is kind of an academic way of viewing these policy changes, and just illustrating it with an example that Adrian touched on, the 90-day suspension of refugee resettlement. You hear 90 days. 90 days does not sound that long, but it is a justice delayed is justice denied situation because there are so many moving parts in that program. And this applies to all programs, but refugee resettling is just something I'm familiar enough with to talk about. So if you are a refugee, you are living in a refugee camp in another country, let's say Kenya, and you are in the process of getting resettled, which is a process that takes years. It is often so long that it takes generations. Many people flee their home country, go to a refugee camp, and it's their children or grandchildren that are eventually resettled to the US. And if you are selected for resettlement, there are all these moving parts. So for example, you have to get a medical exam that is only good for a certain period of time. You have to get a security clearance that is only good for a certain period of time. The administrative bodies that deal with all of these separate pieces are coordinating all of this, and they have limited time and resources. So if at the end of these 90 days, refugee resettlement is restarted, your medical exam is expired, your security clearance has expired, the person who is supposed to help you get on an airplane is doing something else, and getting all of that restarted can take years, and it can actually make it so you never end up coming to the United States. And on the other side of it, literally on the other side here in the US, the refugee resettlement agencies that are working on this side to help people get resettled, to get them, the benefits that they're entitled to when they get here, make sure that they are able to navigate their new lives in the US, have lost employees because of the funding freeze. They might have had to shut down entirely, and now all of the work that was on 3 agencies is on 1 agency that has half the staff that they did 90 days ago. So it just disrupts all of these different agencies, all of these different moving parts, to a point where when it gets restarted, it's not necessarily restarted. It also, all of these policy changes have a huge effect on the immigration system in general. If you put more people into deportation proceedings, the backlog at the court grows and grows and grows and grows. So a case that maybe before could have been handled by a local USCIS, which is the immigration office, is now an immigration court, which means instead of having, say, what we have now in our jurisdiction, which is maybe a 2-year wait to get to your immigration hearing, now it's a 5-year wait or a 6-year wait or a 7-year wait. And that is too long to wait to be able to present your asylum case. And just overwhelming the system in general is something that was the same before, and it seems like it's going to be the same this time as well. There's also changes that get made that you don't have to issue an executive order for, because it's just bureaucratic changes. For example, during the last administration, USCIS started rejecting asylum applications if we didn't put NA in every single box that wasn't applicable. So the instructions might say, skip this section if you don't have children. But a bureaucratic change was made, so they started rejecting all of these asylum applications. Not everybody received the rejection notice. Some people, by the time they got their rejection notice, they'd missed the deadline to file, and so now it is much more difficult or impossible for them to file for asylum at all. So it changes a lot of that too. And the last kind of thing that I wanted to touch on, it's the same when you have all of these policy changes that even experts struggle to keep up with and understand, is just the fear that it sows in the community. Folks who might have, for example, a very good asylum case might be very reluctant to file it because they see all of these policy changes and think it's not worth the risk, or I don't think that I'll be approved even though I should be. And so maybe I'll just try to remain, off the radar. And so the fear that it sows in communities and the amount of legitimacy that it gives to people who are fear mongering is also just a very large thing that we have to grapple with.
Right. And if, all the changes, the rapid change of immigration policy isn't confusing enough, you have the legal challenges and the judicial response to it, and the preliminary injunctions, and whether or not something is valid while the court case is being tried, and there's lawsuits left and right. The big one right now is behind birthright citizenship, because the EO tried to end birthright citizenship, and then there was injunction, and keeping up with that really on a daily basis, so you know what you can and can't do for your client at that given time. It can be pretty complicated.
Thank you both. Adrian, I'll start with you on this, and then we'll move on to Morgan to answer the same question. Within your organizations that you are in, what services or clinics already existed prior to these executive orders to help these communities? And what services, clinics were added after these executive orders to better support their needs?
Okay, so before the executive orders, our organization was already deeply involved with providing full legal representation to vulnerable immigrants. So that included asylum seekers, unaccompanied children, survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking, and individuals in deportation proceedings. We also had programs in place to assist with pro se work. So if individuals could not find full legal representation and we did not have the capacity to take their case, we created asylum clinics and clinics for employment authorization documents to assist them. On those days, we sit with them, we review, we train them on asylum law and, you know, their rights, and review the asylum application with them and fill it out and help them send it that day to the immigration court, or if it's an affirmative case, to the USCIS office who has jurisdiction over Ohio. We also were doing community outreach and education before. After the executive orders, that has really ramped up. We're doing about 3 to 5 a week, depending on the week, where we're going out to communities, whether it's employers who staff a lot of immigrant workers, or community or partner organizations that want to train their staff to do Know Your Rights or learn more about what they can do to help immigrants or immigrants communities in general, or out to parishes to educate them on their rights, immigration relief, or what to do if you encounter ICE targeted enforcement or raids. We had the pro se clinics before. We are really ramping them up now. We have a partnership right now with Jones Day, and they're giving us their volunteer time, which we're very appreciative of, to help prepare these applications. But those clinics really need a lot of manpower behind them, because each application will take 3 to 4 hours to put together. Those services were critical before, but with all the new restrictions and increased enforcement and reduced legal pathways, they're now even more essential.
Very similar at our organization. Legal Aid's immigration department was already serving basically the same populations and representing them in immigration cases. We already had asylum clinics very similar to the one Adrian's talking about. We have a time, a date. We have, usually about 15 to 20 asylum applicants show up, volunteer attorneys for an AM and a PM shift. And it's about 3 to 4 hours per application. You sit down, fill out the asylum application, and then we actually have our paralegals send the asylum applications out in the next couple of days. We are doing lots of community outreach, Know Your Rights. That has been ramping up to an extent that is actually kind of beyond our capacity, because a lot of folks are worried about an ICE raid and how do we prepare for it and what do we do after it. But the thing that I'm trying to focus on the most is we do a lot of pro bono placement. So attorneys, again, who are not necessarily immigration attorneys, but they're willing to take on an immigration case, they take one on, and then they have me as a mentor to guide them through everything, check their work, make sure it's submitted properly, help them keep up with it while it's processing, all of that. And I also do Pro Se Plus, which is a hybrid or virtual opportunity where usually it's an asylum applicant, but it could be another type of application. And instead of sending them to the in-person clinic, we would have the volunteer attorney work with them over Zoom or the phone or WhatsApp or whatever is convenient, meet with the applicant a few times to complete their asylum application. And then either myself or the attorney signs as the preparer. There's also a mentorship aspect to that. I help you with everything. I suggest changes, but it's a little bit more in depth than just an in-person asylum clinic, because you can meet multiple times and I can provide, revisions and suggestions. And that's something that you can do from anywhere. You don't need to be here in Ohio, but since this is in the news, we have more people interested in that. And so it's expanding kind of on its own because there are more interested volunteers.
Thank you. There's a couple questions in the chat that I think this is a good time to address in relation to your organizations or other resources you're aware of. Some of the individuals on this call are wondering where they can get certain information to help prepare as an employer for a potential ICE raid, so that they know what they can do, what their rights are there. So if either of you have a specific resource for employers. And then there's also questions from individuals asking individuals that have green cards, should they be concerned, and what should they be carrying with them to prove citizenship? Or you know, that they're have a visa status or any of those things. So are there particular places where you hold those resources to answer those questions?
I have access to a lot of resources. I'm sure Morgan does too. I can either, you know, my contact information can be shared. You can reach out to me directly, or I can send them over the CNBA to distribute to everybody who's on this call. I always recommend that if you have lawful status, you should be carrying that lawful status with you at all times in case of an ICE raid. What we see happening is that people don't have that documentation and they're getting detained, and even detention for a day can be very disruptive to an individual and their family members. So making sure you have that documentation on you is very important.
Yeah, there are a lot of great resources out there. The red card is kind of the gold standard for folks that are concerned that they might get picked up in an ICE raid, keeping in mind that your constitutional rights as far as the First and Fourth and Fifth still apply. For me, ABLE, ABLE, Advocates for Basic Legal Equality in Dayton, kind of has the best know your rights resources for various populations and different audiences, including like educators, for example, medical providers. And so I often send folks to that website. But yeah, if anybody has something in particular they're curious about, reach out to me or Adrian. And everybody should be carrying proof of status. If they even just have something pending, but they don't necessarily have lawful status, I would recommend having the receipt notice. And then there's kind of debate about this among the community, but if you have no lawful status, some attorneys advise keeping evidence on you that you have been in the US for at least 2 years.
And Morgan referenced red cards or know your rights cards. You might see those going around in the community, and what they really do is, you know, a lot of immigrants, either they don't want to speak to ICE or they don't speak, you know, they don't speak English. And so what these cards say is that I'm choosing to exercise my right to remain silent. I'm refusing to sign anything until my attorney reviews it. If I'm detained, I request to contact my attorney. And then it has like a space for an emergency contact number on there. So they could just give those to an ICE officer when they're in a situation like that.
And with that, I would like to point out, just in case everyone doesn't know, there's no public defender equivalent in immigration law. So when you're saying, I want to speak to my attorney, that means you know who your attorney is going to be. That attorney has hopefully already agreed to do this. You call them and you're probably paying for them. It is not like a criminal detainment where you can ask for a public defender.
Right, and I'll throw out some numbers there. Right now, the Cleveland Immigration Court has over 57,000 pending cases, and about 61% are not represented.
Thank you. And for everyone on the call, we will send out an information sheet to everyone on this call that will have the websites of the organizations that were mentioned that have some of those Know Your Rights resources. Adrian, here in Cleveland, there are a number of non-legal groups that offer aid as well to these communities. Can you tell us a few of those organizations and what they do?
We're very lucky in Cleveland to have so many great organizations supporting newcomers to the Cleveland area. The first one that I will mention is Building Hope in the City. So they operate something called the Hope Center here in Cleveland. They serve immigrants and refugees by providing community connection, mentorship, employment assistance, after-school programming. They have really great classes for refugees and immigrants who want to learn English or civics. Another one is USCRI. They're another resettlement agency here in Cleveland. They provide similar services to immigrants and refugees coming to our country. Our office, Cleveland Catholic Charities Migration Refugee Services, we just don't take volunteers for legal immigration services. We will take volunteers for other services as well. We have a great mentorship program where somebody could reach out and kind of mentor a refugee in the United States, helping them with, you know, connecting them to community resources and things like that. Resource Cleveland, formerly known as the Refugee Response. They do a lot of great work with newcomers. community resource navigation, helping with basic needs, employment, and social services. And they work closely with local organizations and churches to provide direct services as well. And there's Global Cleveland. That's a citywide initiative to really promote immigrant inclusion and economic opportunity here in Cleveland for newcomers. They partner with businesses and community organizations to really enhance our reputation as a welcoming city. And they do take applications for volunteers as well. Cleveland Jobs with Justice is another great organization. It's a worker and immigrant rights organization. They advocate for fair wages, workplace protections, and social justice policies. And again, these are a lot of organizations, but Lindsay's going to put these all together and send them out after. And then I'll end with Americans Making Immigrants Safe. So they provide financial assistance and essential resources specifically for asylum seekers. Asylum seekers don't have access to public benefits, and they, at times, for 6 months or a year at a time, do not have access to work legally. So AMI really stepped in and created a fund where they can pull from to help asylum seekers cover their basic needs, whether it's be shelter or food, or other needs that they have at that time. So they take donations, and I do believe they take volunteers as well in the community.
Thank you. Morgan, do you have any that you would like to add statewide or in the area?
Just a few in Columbus. We're a little bit jealous of Cleveland. They do have a lot of organizations providing these services. Here, I would say besides legal aid, we also have CRIS, Community Refugee and Immigration Services, which provides legal resources. They're a resettlement agency. They have a department that helps folks with their public benefits, one that helps folks with job seeking, housing. They have a lot of different services, and they are really incredible. I also would say ETSS, which is Ethiopian Tewolde. You know what? I forget the acronym, but they also do some resettlement, some victim of crime advocacy services, and a few other services. Jewish Family Services also does a lot of that same work. And that's honestly, we have a shortage of services in Columbus, I would say. But those are some organizations doing great work.
Thank you. There are a lot of attorneys and community members generally, but also on this call, who would like to help, but they aren't sure where to start or what to do. We'll start first with non-lawyers. We just talked about some of the organizations that exist, but what are some really important things that non-lawyers who want to help should be looking for or doing?
I think first, and volunteer at the organizations that we referenced, and that will be dispersed by Lindsay, the CMBA. Every organization has their own way of utilizing volunteers, and the ones that Morgan and I just mentioned, they're not limited to legal work. They do a lot of other great work in the community, and really seeing where they have gaps at those specific organizations, and being flexible with them, because sometimes volunteer management can, take a lot of capacity. And so it might, depending on their needs, and what you're able to do, it would be a great resource for them. One thing that we struggle with are finding volunteer interpreters. And so if you speak another language and you want to dedicate your time to an organization like ours, we need interpreters and translators as well. Host or assist with donation drives. You can partner with a local community organization or a parish to do drives to get goods together for refugees and immigrants. Those are always very popular in our community. They're drained very quickly, so continuing that work as we face new immigration restrictions and increasing needs from the immigrant community would be very important. Providing mentorship and support to immigrants in your community. I think, if you don't know an immigrant, you can get connected to the immigrant community through those organizations that I touched on. They're really involved. And just establishing those relationships and offering what you can do in any way. I'm obviously advocating for immigrant rights. So that's going to be contacting your congressional reps and advocating for the rights of immigrants in Ohio and in your area. And then I did talk about the pro se clinics, but you don't have to be an attorney to help us prepare forms. We do a full training for volunteers at those clinics. We'll train you on asylum law. We'll train you on how to complete the applications, and the applications are always reviewed by an immigration attorney before they're submitted. And so again, you don't have to be barred to assist with those clinics.
Thank
A
you.
very similar, oh, sorry.
No, go
Very
ahead.
similar answers. So much of practicing immigration law is sitting down with somebody who is applying for immigration relief and getting their address history, the name and date of birth of all of their siblings, everywhere they have ever worked, everywhere they have ever gone to school, which is a lot of time that you do not need to be an attorney to do. And non-attorneys can absolutely do that. You can come to our asylum clinics, and I can also pair with you on Pro Se Plus assistance, where you can do a lot of this legwork of collecting this information, putting it together in a form, and then I'm the one who reviews and submits. There's just so much legwork that if you take it off our plate, it's very helpful. But other than that, I would just, everything Adrienne said, I would also say.
Yeah, and then you add into that interpretation. And so that 1 hour meeting actually turns to be 3 hours because of all the
Yes.
support between interpreter. And I did forget to mention that I think I'll touch on this again, but we also have the ability for volunteers to come and assist us more on a weekly basis. If people are interested in dedicating more time than just the pro se clinics, you can come in and help with form prep, like Morgan mentioned. You can help with our intake team, or you can help attorneys prepare for litigation as well.
Thank you both. Morgan, I'll pose this to you first. We've kind of touched on it, but immigration isn't a practice area you can just pick up quickly. The risk of not doing things correctly is pretty significant. So for the non-immigration lawyers who would like to help from a legal perspective, what are some things that they can do to support you that may not involve being able to actually help from an immigration law perspective?
Almost none of my volunteers are immigration attorneys. Immigration attorneys have an unlimited pool of clients. There are not enough immigration attorneys in the state to represent everybody who needs their services. Even if folks are able to pay for an immigration attorney, there are simply not enough of them. Adrienne mentioned the backlog at the immigration court recently. That is just folks who are in court, not the vast majority of folks who are applying for various things through USCIS, like family reunification or citizenship. I don't know how many immigration attorneys there are in Ohio, but it's not even enough for those 56,000 cases. My volunteers are not immigration attorneys, and my program welcomes you. And I promise immigration law is not as scary as it sounds, and most of it really is form filling. And I'll mentor you through the whole process, and I'll check everything.
And Morgan, just for those on the call who aren't located near you, a lot of your work is done virtually. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Adrienne, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think it's also important, like when we are working with an immigrant client, they often have other needs that we can't serve. And our legal aid is different, but Catholic Charities, we practice on immigration law. So we may need an attorney to refer our client to for like a custody determination in probate or juvenile court, or to assist with a power of attorney form, or other forms of family law and civil legal aid. And I feel like what's important is really to utilize the resources and the knowledge of the volunteer. Say somebody who practices criminal law, having that volunteer as a referral source. And I know that's either going to be low bono or pro bono for the client to refer them to. So you're not learning immigration law, you're really just providing the service that you're an expert in. It's very important.
I would add to that, one of our biggest needs are attorneys who are familiar with family law, who can get custody determinations for unaccompanied minors, because you need these very specific findings that allow you to apply for a special program for unaccompanied minors. And most immigration attorneys do not have the time or the competency to do the family law portion of that. And so my dream is to have a family law attorney who will do these custody cases. They're pretty quick and painless as far as family law goes, and then hand off the immigration portion to me.
Thank you. I'm going to get into some of the questions that have been popping up. There are a lot of them. So if your question's not answered, I'll certainly attempt to get in touch with you after. You're more than welcome to contact one of us after this call. Adrian, I'm going to pose this to you because you talked a little bit about the executive orders and some of the changes that have been going on. There are some questions here about how there were certain areas where individuals could go that were considered private and safe spaces where ICE could not enter. Churches is being used as an example in a number of these questions. Can you just speak on any changes in that area and what's happening from a legal perspective when ICE is entering some of these facilities?
Right. I want to be clear. ICE could always enter those facilities. They just had a policy where it really, I mean, to speak plainly, it just didn't really look good for them to be going into healthcare facilities or churches, or courts, because really that would discourage the immigrant from going to that location in the first place. And what the change did when they really rescinded that sensitive location policy was just say, we're not going to take that approach anymore. You can go. They were always able to go. It was more of like what word am I thinking of?
It was a suggestion. It wasn't a rule.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, I can expand on it a little bit more. Well, are we seeing anything happen in our area where they're going in? I haven't heard anything where they're going into the churches. I know there was a recent lawsuit by over 20 religious organizations that sued on that I think in the last few days. There's always a new lawsuit coming up. We haven't heard them going into healthcare facilities, although they have been at court. ICE was at the immigration court yesterday and the day before, and that is very concerning. A lot of our attorneys here in my practice were asking for virtual hearings, final hearings, and so we don't have our client going to the court and getting arrested by ICE and detained throughout the duration of their process. Do you have anything to add to that, Morgan?
There is concern that ICE will start going to other courts, not immigration court. And so the effect of that is if you are somebody who's worried about getting picked up by ICE and you get, I don't know, a speeding ticket or driving without a license ticket, or your dog got loose ticket, that now you're making the decision of, do I want to not show up to my court date and get a bench warrant where I may get picked up later, or do I want to go to my hearing and almost certainly get picked up? So it discourages folks from doing things that we want them to do, which is go to court for their charges. And it also discourages folks from, maybe they get a speeding ticket that they think they shouldn't have. You're definitely going to pay that ticket now. You're not going to go fight it if you're worried that ICE is going to be there for you.
That opens up. Go ahead, Morgan.
Sorry, it also discourages survivors of crime from going, and this is something that I've seen, if they're worried that ICE might come to court, it discourages survivors of crime from going to court to see the person who committed the crime against them, and either testify against them or see the proceedings.
Thank you. So that opens up a number of other questions. So it's a two-part. So first, going back to ICE entering hospitals or churches, first, under what circumstances would ICE need a warrant, and who does that warrant need to be issued from? And under what circumstances would they need a warrant, right? So if you have a room in your workplace that has a sign on it that says private, do they need a warrant to enter those locations?
So this could be a 1 hour presentation by itself. And just, I guess the quick version of it is it's similar, it's the same as all other types of law enforcement. They can wander around in public and talk to whoever they want, as long as they're not doing so in a way that would make a reasonable person feel like they are being detained. They can walk into Target and do the same thing. Anywhere that anybody else would be able to walk into, like the waiting room of a hospital, they can go in and they can ask questions, as long as they're not detaining someone, and they can do that without a warrant. To go into so-called private areas, like if you wanted to go into into a hospital but back into where the patients are, that maybe you're not allowed to go back there without checking in, you will probably need a warrant or somebody who's just willing to let you in. So if there's an area that you would need a warrant to go into, like a private home, for example, is like the ultimate example, because it's not really a gray area about whether it's public or private. They should have a warrant to go in, but if they knock on the door and you say, yes, come on in, they don't need a warrant anymore. And of course, there's other exceptions like hot pursuit. But what the warrant is, there are two types of warrants that you're going to see with ICE. One, and if you just Google like ICE versus judicial warrant, you'll see really good examples of it. But there is a warrant that ICE writes for themselves. And it's just like, hey, we, the Department of Homeland Security or ICE, are issuing this warrant to go pick up so-and-so or to go into this area, signed by us, ICE. This is not legally enforceable, but you see the word warrant and you think, oh, this is very serious. The other type of warrant is a judicial warrant, and that will be from a court signed by a judge, and it will not have the word alien in it. It will not have the word immigration in it. It will always be a specific person. And that is a real warrant, and it's, enforceable. So in the heat of the moment, it can be hard to remember to look at that, but it is important to see if the warrant that they say that they have is actually a real warrant. And I would also say, maybe Adrian has, but in all my years of doing this, I have never seen ICE show up with a judicial warrant. I have only seen them show up with their own internal warrants.
Yes, I agree. And what we've been encouraging employers and community organizations is having a workplace plan. Do not rely on all staff to know how to read a warrant. So your plan should look like, let ICE in, be polite and call your general counsel or call this immigration attorney that you have on call to make these determinations for you. And training staff to remain calm and not giving consent to enter. Not putting that pressure on them to make that determination, and really having that one or two people to turn to in situations like that come up. And also marking areas as private space. If you have private space in an office and you want people to know it's private, putting up a sign saying private office space is very helpful too.
Thank you. There is a comment here from a criminal defense attorney who's on the call, who's starting to see ICE show up at courthouses to arrest. A criminal defense attorney with no immigration experience, what are some things that kind of attorney or an individual who's in the middle of all of this, what should they be doing in those situations?
Maybe Adrian has a really good answer for this, but this is kind of the nightmare scenario because you can't not go to your court hearings. And if ICE is there, they're there. I think, I'm not a criminal defense attorney, but if you are able to get a virtual hearing, or if you are able to appear without your client, or you are able to settle outside of court, which would mean ICE isn't going to know necessarily when you're there, I think those are the moves. This is not legal advice though, because again, this is kind of an emerging area that I'm not an expert in.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's also facilitating their access to an immigration counsel and continue to assist them with their criminal case. I'm an immigration attorney with no criminal background experience. So working together with an immigration attorney, you can really impact that person's life. And likely in a lot of cases, they're being detained, and there's a lot of barriers there. They're only allowed to contact an attorney that is on the pro bono provider list for free. They might not have funding, making sure their family members have connection to the immigration attorney so that person can help them with bond and things like that.
Thank you. There are some general questions here about what courts handle these immigration cases, whether they're separate courts or federal courts, and whether those individuals, which we've touched on a little bit, but just to clarify, receive counsel if they can't afford it, and then unaccompanied minors, what happens to them, what courts they go through, and what kind of resources they're provided.
Right. I'll start with this, and Morgan, you can follow up. The immigration court is an administrative court. There's only one in Ohio. It's here in Cleveland. Each state, not every state has its own court, but the immigration court here has jurisdiction over Ohio only. No, they are not provided access to counsel. There's no public defender, like Morgan said. They're given a list of organizations, pro bono organizations they can call to get an attorney. All of us are stretched thin at capacity. So in most cases, we're referring them to private attorneys where they can pay if they have the funds to do so. And unfortunately, the same is for unaccompanied minors. Unaccompanied minors are not provided any type of legal representation here in Ohio. At Catholic Charities, we do have a program. We have a fellow through the Ohio Access to Justice Foundation that goes to court once a week and helps unaccompanied minors with their first hearing and gives them brief advice and can take their case if needed. But it depends on the state and what grants each program have to help them. There's no federal funds or state funds to provide that assistance to unaccompanied minors, and they all go through the same immigration court.
Yeah, I would just add that, I mean, you touched on it, but like to state it more plainly, frankly, if you are in immigration court, there's virtually no, I would say maybe a dozen people a year get a pro bono attorney for removal. There is just very, very, very few attorneys that are able and willing to do full representation, like not just pro se assistance, but full representation for somebody in immigration court. So most folks are either able to pay, or they're doing this pro se, or maybe they're getting a little bit of help from an attorney, but they're doing it largely pro se. And yes, the same is true for unaccompanied minors. Very often unaccompanied minors are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, SIJS, but there is a shortage of family law attorneys who can get those findings that we mentioned earlier in family court. And when we can get those findings and apply for SIJS, very often you can get that child out of immigration court, which is like a huge life-changing thing. So family law attorneys like you are so, so, so needed. I have, and I'm sure Adrian has, I've represented infants many, 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 many times in immigration court. There are no special programs that guarantee children an attorney in immigration court, or that gets them out of immigration court.
I also want to highlight that the national average for the asylum grant, I think it's still like 15%, unless you've heard different, Morgan. So,
no, the denial rate for our jurisdiction, the denial rate for asylum cases in immigration court is about 90%, is my understanding. But of course, the group that tracks that took everything off their website.
Talking about funding, there's some question. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about some freezes, and there's some temporary freezes on funding. However much you both are willing to share, but people are wondering how if you're concerned about the status of your current funding and how the community can help provide additional funding to your organizations or others to make sure that this work can continue.
Right. I think each of us have our own specific needs. We have already lost some federal funding, and we anticipate losing more in the next 6 months. We are really working hard to strengthen our relationships with our current funders and apply for new grants to cover the anticipated loss. But of course, we take donations on our website, and I can pass that information further, or if anybody wants to reach out to me directly to talk about donations, they can, and I can help facilitate that.
We at LASCO and legal aids in general, we're very fortunate that our funding is not necessarily from federal agencies. So there's not an immediate concern about loss of funding. I definitely would suggest if you're able to donate that you donate to other organizations who are not that fortunate, like Catholic Charities, like Chris in Columbus, resettlement agencies in general, refugee resettlement agencies just lost a massive amount of their funding, and that means they're going to lose a massive amount of their staff. And then I would also encourage you to look into your community, what mutual aid groups are already set up, because what a huge need is filing fees for immigration are very expensive. If you are filing just for your green card, you are often looking at thousands of dollars in expenses. And if there is a mutual aid system already set up in your community, you might be able to pay for somebody to apply for their green card or apply for their spouse to join them in the US.
Thank you. A clarifying question from early in the presentation. Adrian, you had been talking about refugees. There's a question here of whether you said there's no refugees that will be allowed in the country for at least 90 days. Can you clarify what you were referring to, if you remember?
So the refugee resettlement program that's operated through the government, where they would allow refugees to come into the country and be resettled by resettlement organization. That entire program has been stopped. So no refugees can enter for the next 90 days. The Trump administration has to review that every 90 days. And again, I think I made a comment, but yeah, our national partners are saying it's very unlikely that they're going to allow refugees to enter the country in the next couple of years.
There's some questions here about whether or not you have the information on how many people are currently in Cuba who have been sent to Guantanamo Bay, and if there's judges there to hear the cases. Does detaining individuals in Guantanamo Bay change that process at all?
I don't know the number unless you do, Morgan. It just
I sure
started.
don't. Right. I wasn't even sure if it had actually started yet.
It did. I know a flight landed, but I don't know the number. But the immigration detainees do not go to immigration court ever while they're detained. So it's all done virtually. They still have access to the immigration court. I don't know which immigration courts will have jurisdiction over the Guantanamo detainees at this time.
Thank you. There's a number of individuals asking for naturalized citizens or US-born citizens who have been hearing about citizens also being detained. And we mentioned this a little bit earlier in the presentation. What should US citizens that are concerned that they may be targeted and detained, what should they be carrying with them, and how should they be preparing for that? Same with their children.
I think if you're really concerned about it, proof that you're a US citizen, and that would be a certificate of naturalization, a US passport, a certificate of citizenship, which is, I don't like carrying something like that because if you lose it, your identity is absolutely getting stolen. So it is hard. I think the most important thing that you can do, though, if that is something you're concerned about, is have somebody's phone number memorized who knows like what the deal is, who can get into your house, who can like go to your lockbox and get your passport, who can call your attorney, who can feed your cat. Like preparing in advance by having somebody that you're going to call is, I think, what you should be doing.
I've heard several US citizens or naturalized citizens getting the passport card instead of carrying their actual book around.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. I want to give you both an opportunity if there's anything that you want to make sure you add in before we wrap up.
Thank you for having us. Please reach out if you want to volunteer with our organization or make a donation. My information will be shared. I have access to a lot of resources. Even if you just want us to come out and do a Know Your Rights presentation, we have staff who are willing and able to do that. Go ahead, Morgan.
Same. I'd love to have you as a volunteer. It might take me a little bit to get back to you because it's just me. And tell your friends who are family law attorneys, they can do this kind of quick and easy custody thing and like really honestly like make just a huge impact on a child's life. Most of these kids who need a family law attorney to do this, they are here without their parents. They do not have access to money to pay a family law attorney. And there's really almost no free attorneys to do that part of the process.
Well, thank you both for being here. We have over 100 people here live, and in addition to people on Facebook. So glad to see so many of you here today. We will send out from the CMBA a list of resources that were talked about and contact information so that if you want to volunteer and help, you have an avenue to do so. I'll turn it back over to Dominica, but thank you all so much for being here.
Yes, thank you, Adrian, Morgan, and Lindsay for having this space for this discussion. More to come on this front, certainly. Everyone, I dropped the link in the chat for the CLE survey. We'll also be emailing that out to you along with the materials that Lindsay had mentioned. So with that, we can go ahead and conclude. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Have a great afternoon, everyone.